The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Daniel Mercer's modest apartment in Portland, casting long shadows across his living room. At 32, he had built a life that most would consider stable. A respectable job as a graphic designer, a small but comfortable home, and a tight circle of friends who understood why he sometimes cancelled plans at the last minute. What they couldn't fully comprehend was the weight he had carried for the past 6 years. The absence that had become a permanent fixture in his life, like a room in his heart that remained perpetually dark. 6 years ago, on a mild October evening, Daniel's grandmother, Eleanor Mercer, had walked out the front door of her home and vanished. At 74, with Alzheimer's disease steadily eroding her memory, Eleanor had become increasingly confused in the months leading up to her disappearance. The family had taken precautions, alarms on doors, a medical alert bracelet, scheduled check-ins. But somehow, during a brief 20-minute window, when her caregiver stepped out to retrieve medication from the pharmacy, Eleanor had slipped away. The search that followed was exhaustive. Daniel had taken leave from work, coordinating with local police, organizing volunteer search parties that combed through neighborhoods, parks, and wooded areas. Flyers with Eleanor's gentle, smiling face appeared on telephone poles and storefront windows throughout the city. Her case was featured on local news segments, then briefly on a national missing persons program. But as weeks turned to months, the trail grew cold. Eleanor, with her silver bob and kind blue eyes, had simply vanished without a trace. In those first desperate months, Daniel had learned more about missing persons cases than he ever wanted to know. He discovered that over 100,000 people with dementia go missing each year in the United States alone. He learned about the golden hour, that critical first 24 hours when finding a confused elderly person unharmed is most likely. He immersed himself in search strategies, missing persons networks, and the painful statistics of recovery rates that declined with each passing day. His boss at the design agency had been understanding at first, offering paid leave and flexibility. But as weeks stretched into months with no sign of Eleanor, Daniel's obsession with finding her began to affect his work. Projects were delivered late, his once meticulous designs now rushed and uninspired. 8 months after Eleanor's disappearance, he was called into a meeting with HR. They offered him a choice: refocus on his work or take an extended unpaid leave. Daniel chose the latter, using his savings to sustain his search while freelancing just enough to keep his apartment. The hardest part, Daniel often told his therapist during those first 2 years, isn't just that she's gone. It's not knowing. Not knowing if she's afraid, if she's cold, if she's... He never finished that sentence. The possibilities too painful to articulate. The therapist, Dr. Levine, had gently suggested that Daniel might need to consider the possibility that they would never know what happened to Eleanor. Sometimes closure doesn't come in the form we expect, she had said. Sometimes we have to create it for ourselves. Daniel had nodded politely, but rejected the idea internally. Closure without answers seemed like surrender, and he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. His mother, Catherine, had approached the loss differently. While Daniel threw himself into the search with single-minded determination, Catherine had retreated into a quiet, private grief. A high school English teacher with 30 years in the classroom, she had taken a brief leave after her mother's disappearance, but returned to work quickly, explaining to Daniel that her students needed her. In reality, Daniel suspected it was Catherine who needed the students, their noise and energy and demands providing a necessary distraction from the deafening silence of uncertainty. Their different approaches to grief had created a widening gulf between mother and son. Daniel interpreted Catherine's return to routine as giving up. Catherine viewed Daniel's all-consuming search as an unhealthy fixation that was destroying his life. Their conversations grew strained, then infrequent. 3 years after Eleanor's disappearance, Catherine accepted an offer to teach at a prestigious private school in Phoenix. She called it a career opportunity. Daniel called it running away. On this particular Tuesday, Daniel had called in sick to work. It wasn't a physical ailment, but rather an emotional anniversary that kept him home, 6 years exactly since Eleanor's disappearance. These marker days always hit him hard, leaving him hollow-eyed and distracted. His routine on such days was always the same. He would page through old photo albums, watch home videos where Eleanor's laugh could still be heard clear and strong, before her illness had begun its cruel theft of her memories. The photo album currently open on his lap was bound in faded blue cloth, its pages yellowing at the edges. It predated digital photography, filled instead with carefully mounted snapshots from the 1980s and early 90s. Eleanor and her late husband Robert on fishing trips and at family barbecues, a young Catherine with feathered hair and shoulder pads, and Daniel himself, gap-toothed, skinny-limbed, often clutching a chess piece or book. His fingers lingered on a particular photo, himself at 8, sitting across a chessboard from Eleanor. The concentration on his small face was almost comical in its intensity, while Eleanor watched him with that particular mixture of patience and amusement that had characterized her love. She had taught him the game over a summer vacation, never letting him win, but never crushing him either, teaching him to see defeat as merely a step toward improvement. "Your mind is like a muscle," she had told him. "The harder the workout, the stronger it grows." Years later, when he learned about her diagnosis, those words had returned to him with painful irony. By mid-afternoon, emotionally drained, Daniel had settled on the couch, mindlessly flipping through television channels. The rhythmic clicking of the remote was almost hypnotic, images flashing before his eyes without really registering. News, commercial, cooking show, more news. He paused on a local station broadcasting live from downtown. The reporter, a woman with carefully styled blonde hair, stood on a busy street corner discussing an upcoming festival. Daniel's finger hovered over the button, ready to continue his aimless channel surfing, when something in the background caught his eye. Behind the reporter, pedestrians moved through the frame, business people hurrying back from lunch, tourists consulting maps, everyday life unfolding in real time. But there, at the edge of the shot, partially obscured by a newspaper stand, stood an elderly woman. She wore a faded blue cardigan despite the warm weather, her thin white hair disheveled by the breeze. She seemed disoriented, clutching a handbag close to her chest as she looked around with uncertain eyes. Daniel sat up slowly, his heart beginning to race. There was something achingly familiar about the woman's posture, the particular way she tilted her head. He moved closer to the screen, scrutinizing every pixel of her partially visible face. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice cracking. The camera panned slightly as the reporter gestured toward a building behind her, bringing the elderly woman more fully into frame. For 3 breathtaking seconds, Daniel could see her clearly, the delicate curve of her nose, the worried furrow of her brow that had deepened with age and confusion. Though thinner now, her face gaunt with the passage of years, there was no mistaking Eleanor Mercer. "Oh my God!" Daniel gasped, fumbling for his phone with trembling hands. "Oh my God, it's her!" He dialed the news station first, his words tumbling out in a frantic stream. The receptionist transferred him twice before he reached someone who could help, a production assistant who promised to contact the field crew immediately. Daniel paced his living room as he waited, unable to sit still, terrified that by the time anyone reached the location, his grandmother would once again vanish into the anonymous flow of the city. His second call was to his mother, Catherine, who had moved to Arizona 3 years after Eleanor's disappearance, a decision that had caused tension between them. Daniel felt she had given up. Catherine insisted she was preserving her own sanity. Their relationship had never fully recovered. "Mom," he said when she answered, his voice tight with emotion, "I just saw Grandma on TV. She's alive. She's downtown." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Daniel," Catherine finally said, her voice gentle but strained, "we've been through this before. The woman at the grocery store last year, the one at the bus station, it wasn't her then, and this is different," Daniel interrupted. "I'm absolutely certain It's her, Mom. She's wearing the blue cardigan Dad gave her for Christmas that last year, the one with the pearl buttons. I would recognize it anywhere." Catherine's breath caught audibly. The cardigan had indeed been a gift from her late husband, a detail no stranger could have known. "Where exactly?" she asked, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Corner of Madison and Fifth. The news crew is trying to find her now. I'm heading there myself." "I'm booking a flight," Catherine said without hesitation. All doubt vanished from her voice. "Call me the second you know anything. And Daniel, be careful. Don't get your hopes too high. It's been so long." But Daniel's hopes were already soaring, impossible to restrain. After hanging up, he grabbed his keys and wallet, nearly forgetting to lock the apartment in his haste. The drive downtown was a blur of adrenaline and prayer, wordless, desperate appeals to whatever forces might control such impossible moments of chance. 15 minutes later, Daniel double-parked his car near the broadcast location, ignoring the angry honk from a delivery truck behind him. The reporter was gone. The live broadcast concluded. He scanned the street frantically, pushing past irritated pedestrians, checking storefronts and alleyways, his eyes searching for any glimpse of blue fabric or white hair. After 30 minutes of increasingly desperate searching, his phone rang. It was the production assistant from the news station. "Mr. Mercer, the crew found her. She seems confused, doesn't have ID, but she's safe. They're waiting with her at the coffee shop on the corner of Madison and 4th. Daniel ran the entire block, his lungs burning, sweat soaking through his shirt, despite the cool autumn air. He burst through the door of the coffee shop, bell jingling wildly, and immediately spotted the small gathering in the corner, 2 people wearing the news station's logo on their jackets, a barista hovering nearby with concern, and between them, looking small and fragile in a chair, his grandmother. He approached slowly, suddenly afraid. What if she didn't recognize him? What if the disease had progressed so far that the grandson she had once baked cookies with and taught to play chess was now just another stranger in her fractured world? "Grandma," he said softly, kneeling before her chair. "It's me, it's Daniel." Eleanor looked at him with clouded blue eyes, confusion evident in her expression. She clutched her handbag tighter, a reflexive gesture of self-protection. Daniel felt his heart breaking all over again. And then, miraculously, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Daniel," she said, her voice thin and uncertain, "is it time for our chess game? I've been waiting so long." Tears spilled down Daniel's cheeks as he gently took her hand. "Yes, Grandma, I've been waiting too. For 6 years, I've been waiting to find you." The female reporter, who had been on camera earlier, approached cautiously. "Mr. Mercer," she asked, "I'm Alicia Winters. I was broadcasting when you saw your grandmother." Daniel nodded, unable to take his eyes off Eleanor, who was now looking around the coffee shop with renewed confusion. "It's quite extraordinary," Alicia continued. "If we hadn't been filming at that exact spot, at that exact moment—" "I know," Daniel said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've been searching for 6 years, and she appears in the background of your broadcast. What are the odds?" Alicia hesitated, then said, "Would you mind if we followed up on this story? It's remarkable. It might help other families in similar situations." Daniel barely heard her. Eleanor had begun to tremble slightly, overwhelmed by the noise and activity around her. "Maybe later," he said to Alicia. "Right now, I need to get her somewhere quiet, somewhere safe." The hours that followed were a blur of emotion and logistics. The police were called, then paramedics who gently examined Eleanor, finding her malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise in remarkably stable condition, given the circumstances. Daniel never left her side, even when the authorities began their questioning, trying to piece together the impossible puzzle of where Eleanor Mercer had been for 6 years. Their questions yielded few coherent answers. Eleanor's responses were fragmented, lost in the haze of her condition. She spoke of a garden she tended, though whose garden remained unclear. She mentioned a woman named Martha who made good soup. When asked where she had been living, she simply said, "In the blue house with the nice cat." A description too vague to be immediately useful. Detective Lisa Ramirez, who had been assigned to Eleanor's case years earlier, arrived at the hospital with the original missing person file. She had aged since Daniel had last seen her. New lines etched around her eyes, silver threading through her dark hair. But her handshake was as firm as he remembered, her gaze direct and compassionate. "This is unprecedented in my career," she told Daniel, as they stood in the hospital corridor while doctors examined Eleanor more thoroughly. 6 years is, well, it's beyond the statistical probabilities for a positive outcome in cases like these. She's always been stubborn," Daniel said, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Even before the Alzheimer's." Ramirez nodded, making a note in her file. "We'll need to investigate where she's been all this time. The Blue House might be our best lead. Does that reference mean anything to you?" Daniel shook his head. "None of her friends lived in a Blue House that I can remember, but her memory—" He trailed off, the implications hanging between them. "Of course," Ramirez said. "We'll check property records, see if there are any Blue Houses registered to anyone named Martha in the surrounding areas. In the meantime, we'll need to take her fingerprints again, update her medical records. Standard procedure." By evening, Eleanor had been admitted to Portland General Hospital for observation and treatment. Daniel sat beside her bed, holding her frail hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. His mother was on a flight from Phoenix, due to arrive before midnight. For the first time in 6 years, Daniel felt the knot of grief in his chest begin to loosen, replaced by a cautious, tentative hope. The overnight hours passed in a strange limbo of exhaustion and hyper-awareness. Daniel dozed in the uncomfortable hospital chair, jerking awake at every sound, afraid that if he closed his eyes for too long, Eleanor might somehow disappear again. Around 11:30 p.m., Catherine arrived, her face drawn with fatigue from the rushed flight, but her eyes bright with disbelief and hope. Mother and son embraced awkwardly in the doorway of Eleanor's room, years of distance momentarily bridged by shared shock and relief. Catherine then moved to her mother's bedside, a small, choked sound escaping her as she took in Eleanor's diminished form beneath the hospital blankets. "Oh, Mom," she whispered, stroking Eleanor's thin white hair back from her forehead. "Where have you been?" Eleanor stirred at the touch, her eyes opening. For a moment, there was only confusion in her gaze, but then another flicker of recognition. "Catherine," she said clearly, "you're late for school again." Catherine let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "No, Mom, I'm right on time." The following days were a whirlwind of medical tests, police interviews, and emotional reunions. News of Eleanor's miraculous discovery spread quickly through the hospital staff, then to local media. Daniel fielded calls from reporters, while Catherine coordinated with doctors and social workers to develop a care plan for Eleanor once she was released. The full story emerged in pieces over the following week, assembled through police investigation, medical examinations, and fragments of Eleanor's own recollections during her more lucid moments. Martha Collins, a 68-year-old retired nurse, living in a small blue house in a suburban neighborhood just outside Portland, had found Eleanor wandering confused near a bus stop 6 years earlier. According to Martha's statement to police, she had tried to help Eleanor find her way home, but the disoriented woman couldn't remember her address or phone number. Her medical alert bracelet, which should have contained this crucial information, was missing. Later investigation would reveal it had likely fallen off due to a faulty clasp. Martha, who had experience caring for dementia patients during her nursing career, had taken Eleanor home, intending to contact authorities immediately. But a combination of circumstances, Martha's own financial struggles, a healthcare system with limited resources for elder care, and perhaps most significantly, Eleanor's occasional moments of apparent clarity when she insisted she was exactly where she wanted to be, had led to an impossible situation where days turned into weeks and weeks into years. "I kept thinking I would figure it out, find her family somehow," Martha told investigators, tears streaming down her deeply lined face. "But time just passed. She became like family. I never meant to keep her from her real family." The investigators brought Martha to the hospital to be interviewed more thoroughly about the unusual arrangement. Daniel had insisted on being present, needing to understand how his grandmother could have been living just 20 miles away while he searched desperately across the country. Martha Collins was a slight woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her clothes simple but immaculately pressed. Her hands, spotted with age but steady, twisted nervously in her lap as she recounted the events of 6 years ago. "It was raining that evening," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I was coming home from my church group and saw her standing at the bus stop, completely soaked through. No umbrella, no coat, just that blue sweater. I pulled over to ask if she needed help, and she looked at me with such confusion." Martha described how Eleanor had willingly gotten into her car, but couldn't tell her where she lived or who might be looking for her. She kept saying she needed to get home to make dinner for Robert. I later learned that was her husband, who'd been gone for years. "I brought her to my house just to dry off, get warm," Martha continued. "I tried calling the police, but it was a terrible storm that night. Power lines down all over the county. When I finally got through, they said they'd send someone when they could, but they were dealing with accidents, flooding. They told me to keep her safe for the night." Daniel leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "But the night passed. Days passed. Weeks. Years. You must have seen the news reports, the flyers." Martha nodded, shame evident in her downcast eyes. "The first few days, she was so agitated whenever I mentioned calling authorities. She became convinced I was trying to put her in a home, take away her independence. She'd have these moments of such clarity, insisting she was exactly where she wanted to be. As for the news reports," Martha hesitated. "I don't have a television. Gave it up years ago when my husband died. And I rarely leave my neighborhood since I retired. The grocery store, the church, the library sometimes. I know it sounds impossible in this connected age, but I live very simply." The explanation was difficult to accept, yet the detectives had confirmed Martha's lifestyle through neighbors and church members. She lived an almost deliberately isolated existence. Her world contracted to a few square miles, her social circle limited to a handful of equally elderly acquaintances. "When did you realize she had Alzheimer's?" Catherine asked, her tone more measured than Daniel's. "Almost immediately," Martha replied. "I recognized the signs from my nursing days. I told myself I was qualified to care for her, that maybe this was why our paths had crossed. I had her old prescriptions refilled using my Medicare." She broke off, aware she was admitting to fraud. "I know it was wrong," she continued after a moment. "I know I should have tried harder to find her family, but she settled in so quickly, seemed so content in the routine we established. And Martha's voice caught. "I'd been so lonely since my Harold passed. Having Eleanor there, having someone to care for again, it filled a hole in my life. The authorities were considering charges of kidnapping or elder abuse, but the reality was far more complex than criminal intent. Martha had provided Eleanor with shelter, food, and basic medical care, even as her own finances dwindled. There were prescription medications for Eleanor's condition in the bathroom cabinet, obtained through Martha's own Medicare benefits. Neighbors confirmed seeing the two elderly women gardening together, shopping at the local market, even attending community bingo nights. "She was kind to me," Eleanor told Daniel during one of her clearer moments in the hospital. "She let me have the window room so I could see the birds. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't remember what. Sometimes I would wake up and think I should go home, but then I couldn't remember where home was." The discovery raised difficult questions for Daniel and his mother. Their initial anger at Martha gradually gave way to a complicated gratitude. While they had spent years imagining worst-case scenarios, Eleanor alone, afraid, or worse, she had instead been living in a modest but clean home, cared for by someone who, despite her serious lapse in judgment, had shown her kindness. "I should have looked harder," Daniel confessed to his mother one evening in the hospital cafeteria, the weight of guilt heavy in his voice. "The search parties never went as far as Pinewood. It never occurred to us she could have taken a bus that far." Catherine, who had aged visibly in the days since Eleanor's discovery, shook her head. "We did everything we could with the information we had. The police searched. You searched. I searched until I couldn't anymore." She reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "She's back now. That's what matters." Daniel nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. "Do you think we should press charges against Martha?" Catherine considered this carefully. What would that accomplish? She's an old woman who made a terrible mistake, but who also, in her own misguided way, might have saved Mom's life that night. If she'd stayed at that bus stop in the rain. She didn't finish the thought. After consulting with the district attorney, Detective Ramirez informed them that prosecuting Martha would be complicated. The unusual circumstances, Martha's age and lack of criminal intent, and Eleanor's inability to testify coherently would make a conviction difficult. More importantly, the detective gently suggested a public trial would subject Eleanor to stress and confusion that could accelerate her decline. 2 weeks after the miraculous television sighting, Eleanor was released from the hospital into the care of her family. Her Alzheimer's had progressed significantly over the years, and the medical team was frank about her prognosis. She would need constant care, medication management, and eventually, as the disease continued its relentless course, full-time professional assistance. Daniel converted his home office into a bedroom for Eleanor, installing safety features and monitoring systems more sophisticated than those that had failed 6 years earlier. Catherine extended her stay in Portland indefinitely, the years of distance between mother and son beginning to heal as they united in the care of Eleanor. Martha Collins avoided criminal charges after the family declined to pursue them, recognizing the complex moral territory of the situation. Instead, an arrangement was reached where Martha could visit Eleanor regularly, a compromise that acknowledged the genuine, if deeply flawed, care she had provided. The story of Eleanor's discovery and return quickly spread beyond Portland. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets. The image of Daniel and Eleanor reunited in the hospital became briefly viral, a rare good news story in a cycle of troubling headlines. Daniel found himself giving interviews, always careful to balance the joy of finding his grandmother with the sobering reality of her condition and the complicated circumstances of her years away. Alicia Winters, the reporter who had unknowingly captured Eleanor in her live broadcast, produced a special segment on the reunion. She interviewed Daniel, Catherine, and even Martha, crafting a nuanced story about the complexities of elder care, the challenges of Alzheimer's, and the remarkable coincidence that had reunited a family. "It was literally 1 in a million, Alicia said during her broadcast. If our camera had been positioned slightly differently, if Eleanor Mercer had walked by a minute earlier or later, if her grandson hadn't been watching at that exact moment, this family might never have found each other again." The segment went viral online, generating discussion about the inadequacies of systems designed to protect vulnerable adults. Some viewers criticized Martha harshly, others defended her actions as misguided compassion. A few pointed out the failures of a healthcare system that left elderly people like Eleanor and Martha navigating complex medical and social challenges without adequate support. A prominent Alzheimer's Research Foundation reached out, asking if the family would be willing to share their experience as part of a campaign to improve identification and tracking systems for vulnerable adults. Catherine hesitated, protective of their privacy after the media attention, but Daniel saw an opportunity to prevent other families from experiencing what they had. "If our story helps even one family avoid what we went through," he told his mother, "then something good can come from all this." The Foundation's representative, Dr. Samira Patel, visited their home to discuss the potential collaboration. She was in her early 40s, with a warm manner that immediately put Eleanor at ease. As they talked in the living room, Eleanor sat nearby in a comfortable chair, occasionally contributing to the conversation when her attention focused, more often drifting into her own thoughts. "Your grandmother's case is unusual but not unique," Dr. Patel explained. Every year, thousands of people with dementia go missing. Most are found within the first 24 hours, but those who aren't face significant risks. She outlined the Foundation's initiative to develop better tracking systems, not just the medical bracelets that could fall off or be removed, but more integrated approaches using emerging technology. The challenge, she continued, is balancing safety with dignity and privacy. No one wants to feel like they're being monitored constantly, even those with cognitive impairments. From her chair, Eleanor suddenly spoke with unexpected clarity. Nobody wants to be a burden, she said, looking directly at Dr. Patel. That's the worst part, knowing you're becoming someone else's responsibility. Daniel, Catherine, and Dr. Patel all turned to Eleanor, surprised by this moment of lucidity. You're not a burden, Mom, Catherine said gently. Eleanor smiled slightly. I know you have to say that, dear. She looked around the room, momentarily confused again. Is it time for my program? The moment passed, but it left an impression on all of them, a reminder that beneath the confusion of Alzheimer's, Eleanor was still present, still processing her situation in ways they couldn't always access. As autumn faded into winter, life settled into new patterns. Daniel continued working from home, adjusting his schedule around Eleanor's needs. Catherine found a small apartment nearby, close enough to help daily, but maintaining her own space. Martha visited twice a week, bringing fresh flowers from her garden and sitting patiently with Eleanor, even when the older woman didn't remember who she was. Despite the initial awkwardness, a tentative friendship began to develop between Catherine and Martha. They were close in age, both widowed, both devoted to Eleanor in their different ways. Martha's detailed knowledge of Eleanor's routines and preferences over the past 6 years proved invaluable as they established her care plan. In turn, Catherine shared stories from Eleanor's earlier life, filling in the blank spaces in Martha's understanding of the woman she had cared for. She used to be an extraordinary baker, Catherine told Martha one afternoon as they sat together watching Eleanor nap. Her apple pie won the county fair 3 years running. The judges finally asked her to stop entering so someone else would have a chance. Martha smiled. She still perks up whenever I bake apples. I never knew why. These exchanges helped bridge the uncomfortable reality of their situation, that Martha had, however unintentionally, stolen years that the family could never recover. Yet she had also, in her way, preserved Eleanor through a time when she might otherwise have been lost entirely. The holidays approached, bringing both joy and melancholy. It would be their first Christmas together in 6 years, but also a stark reminder of how much had changed, how much they had all lost to time and circumstance. Daniel decorated the apartment carefully, recreating traditions from Eleanor's home before her illness, hoping to trigger pleasant memories without overwhelming her. On Christmas Eve, as soft snow fell outside the windows, Daniel placed a small, carefully wrapped package in Eleanor's hands. She examined it with confusion at first, then with methodical concentration began to unwrap it, her fingers working slowly but deliberately. Inside was a silver-framed photograph of Eleanor with her late husband Robert, taken on their 50th wedding anniversary just months before his heart attack. It was one of the few times in recent weeks that Eleanor showed immediate recognition. "Robert," she said clearly, touching the glass with trembling fingers. "My Robert." Daniel nodded, throat tight with emotion. "That's right, Grandma. That's Grandpa." Eleanor studied the photograph, then looked up at Daniel with a sudden clarity that both thrilled and frightened him. These moments of lucidity had become increasingly rare. "You have his eyes," she said. "I always told him that Daniel had his eyes." Catherine, who had been arranging cookies on a plate nearby, turned away to hide her tears. These precious moments of connection were what they lived for now, brief windows when Eleanor was truly present with them, before the fog of her condition closed in again. Eleanor held the photograph for a long time, occasionally murmuring to it, as if carrying on a private conversation with the husband she had lost 15 years earlier. Then she looked up again, this time at Martha, who sat quietly on the edge of the gathering, still sometimes uncertain of her place. "Martha," Eleanor said clearly, "you should have the blue room ready. Robert will be home for Christmas." Martha glanced uncertainly at Catherine and Daniel, but played along gently. "Everything's ready," she assured Eleanor. "Don't you worry." Later that night, after Eleanor had gone to sleep, Catherine, Daniel and Martha sat before the small Christmas tree, sharing a bottle of wine and the weight of memories. "I still don't understand how no one recognized her all those years," Catherine said, swirling the red liquid in her glass. "We had her picture everywhere. How could she have been living just 20 miles away and no one noticed?" Daniel had pondered this question himself countless times. Martha kept to herself, according to the neighbors. They rarely left Pinewood, and Grandma, he paused, considering. Grandma changed so much, even in those first months before she disappeared. "The disease alters them physically, not just mentally." Catherine nodded slowly. "The doctors told me that stress and new environments can accelerate the progression. By the time Martha found her, she probably already looked different from the photos we circulated. And we stopped looking in the same way after a while," Daniel admitted. "Not stopped completely, but we had to keep living," Catherine finished for him, "even with the hole she left behind." Martha, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "I should have done more to find you," she said quietly. "I told myself I was protecting her, but part of me was afraid of losing her, of being alone again." She looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry for what I took from you both." Catherine reached across the space between them and covered Martha's hand with her own. "You kept her safe," she said simply. "That's what matters now." As winter gradually yielded to spring, Eleanor's condition deteriorated. The periods of clarity grew shorter and more sporadic. The doctors adjusted her medications, but the relentless progress of Alzheimer's continued its course. Daniel found himself grieving all over again, not for her physical absence this time, but for the slow erasure of the woman he had known. Dr. Levine, his therapist from the years of searching, had resumed sessions with him, helping him navigate this new phase of loss. "It's a different kind of grieving," she explained during one session. "Ambiguous loss, when the person is physically present but psychologically absent. In some ways, it can be harder than a clear-cut death." Daniel nodded, having experienced both now. The ambiguous loss of Eleanor's disappearance and the gradual fading of her presence, even after her return. "Sometimes I feel guilty," he admitted, "for wishing for closure one way or another." "Is that terrible?" "It's human, Doctor," Levine assured him, "and it doesn't mean you love her any less." Yet there were unexpected gifts in this difficult time as well. Catherine, who had been so emotionally reserved after her husband's death and then Eleanor's disappearance, slowly thawed. The distance that had grown between mother and son began to close as they shared the daily challenges and occasional triumphs of caring for Eleanor. "You know, she used to do this for me," Catherine said one afternoon as they worked together to bathe Eleanor, who had become increasingly resistant to the shower. "When I had pneumonia as a teenager, she washed my hair in the sink because I was too weak to stand." Daniel looked at his mother in surprise. She rarely shared stories from her childhood. "I didn't know that." Catherine smiled slightly as she gently worked shampoo through Eleanor's thin white hair. "There's a lot we never talked about, you and I. I'm sorry for that." Eleanor, who had been humming tunelessly to herself, suddenly spoke with unexpected clarity. "Catherine always was too serious," she said, patting her daughter's hand with soapy fingers. "Even as a little girl, always carrying the weight of the world." Mother and son exchanged startled glances, then burst into laughter, a moment of pure, unexpected joy in the midst of their daily struggle. Eleanor joined in their laughter, though it was clear she didn't understand the reason for it. It didn't matter. For that brief moment, they were simply a family together, finding happiness where they could. Spring brought another development. The Alzheimer's Foundation, that had reached out earlier, invited Daniel to speak at their annual conference in Chicago. At first, he declined, unwilling to leave Eleanor even for a few days. But Catherine insisted. "I can manage," she assured him. "Martha will help," You need to do this, not just for other families, but for yourself. You've put your entire life on hold." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. The 3-day trip felt both terrifyingly long and strangely liberating. Standing before an audience of researchers, caregivers, and family members affected by Alzheimer's, he shared Eleanor's story, the disappearance, the years of searching, the miraculous discovery, and the complex reality of their reunion. "What happened to my grandmother exposed critical gaps in how we protect and find vulnerable adults," he told the silent room. "But it also showed me something about the human capacity for both kindness and oversight. Martha Collins made a terrible mistake in not reporting my grandmother's presence, but she also showed compassion when she took in a confused stranger. Neighbors saw my grandmother for years, but never connected her to the missing woman from the news. We're simultaneously more connected and more isolated than ever before." The response to his speech was overwhelming. Other families approached him afterward, sharing their own stories of loved ones with dementia. Some still searching, some reunited, some grieving final losses. For the first time, Daniel felt part of a community who truly understood the complex emotions he had navigated alone for so long. Among those who sought him out after his presentation was a woman named Leah Chen, a neurological researcher specializing in Alzheimer's disease. In her early 30s, with an intense focus that reminded Daniel of himself, she explained that she was developing new protocols for community response to wandering incidents. "Your grandmother's case is extraordinary," Leah told him over coffee in the hotel lobby. "Most people with advanced dementia who go missing are found within 72 hours, or..." She didn't need to complete the sentence. They both knew the grim statistics. "I've been thinking about what could have prevented it," Daniel said. "Better tracking technology, obviously, but also better community awareness. If even one person had recognized her from the flyers..." Leah nodded. "That's exactly what my research focuses on. Technology is important, but human connection is equally crucial. Creating networks of awareness in communities, postal workers, bus drivers, convenience store clerks, people who might notice something amiss." They exchanged contact information, Leah promising to send him materials about her program that might help other families in similar situations. Daniel found himself unexpectedly drawn to her combination of scientific precision and genuine compassion. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of personal interest beyond his grandmother's situation. When he returned to Portland, energized and carrying a folder full of new resources and contacts, he found an unexpected scene. Catherine and Martha were sitting at his kitchen table, heads bent together over a photo album, while Eleanor napped peacefully in her room. "What's going on?" he asked, setting down his suitcase. The two women looked up, and Daniel was startled to see they had been crying, not tears of distress, but the cathartic tears that come with shared understanding. "Martha was just telling me about the day they found a nest of baby birds in the garden," Catherine explained. "Mom apparently spent hours watching over them, making sure the neighborhood cats stayed away." Martha nodded, dabbing at her eyes. Eleanor always had such a gentle heart. Even when she couldn't remember what she'd had for breakfast, she remembered those birds, named each one of them. Daniel joined them at the table, and for the next hour they traded stories. Catherine sharing memories from Eleanor's earlier life, Martha filling in details from the missing 6 years. For the first time, Daniel began to see those lost years not as an empty void, but as a different chapter in his grandmother's life, one he hadn't been part of, but that had still held moments of meaning and even joy. "She loved your chess set," Martha told Daniel, pointing to the portable magnetic set he had brought to the hospital during Eleanor's stay. "I found her one at a yard sale. Every morning she'd set it up on the windowsill and move the pieces around. I didn't know the rules, but she seemed to be playing an actual game. Sometimes she'd say, 'Your move, Daniel.'" The thought of his grandmother playing imaginary chess games with him across the miles brought both pain and a strange comfort. Even in her confusion, even separated from her family, some essential connection had remained intact. Throughout that spring, as they settled into the rhythms of caring for Eleanor, Daniel maintained contact with Leah Chen. What began as professional correspondence about her research gradually expanded to include personal exchanges. Daniel found himself looking forward to her emails, which offered not just insight into Alzheimer's care, but glimpses into her own life. Her struggles balancing research with teaching, her passion for classical music, her wry observations about academic politics. In May, Leah emailed to let him know she would be in Portland for a conference the following month. "Would you be willing to meet?" she wrote. "I'd like to learn more about your grandmother's current care situation. It could be valuable for my research." And, she added in a postscript that made Daniel smile, "It would be nice to continue our conversation from Chicago in person." Summer arrived, bringing warm days that allowed them to take Eleanor for short walks in the neighborhood park. Her mobility had declined, necessitating a wheelchair for longer outings, but she still responded positively to being outdoors, tilting her face toward the sun and sometimes commenting on flowers or birds that caught her attention. During one such outing, they encountered Leah Chen, who had arrived in Portland a day early for her conference and had arranged to meet them at the park. She approached with a warm smile, carrying a small potted orchid as a gift for Eleanor. "Dr. Chen," Daniel greeted her, surprised by how pleased he was to see her in person again. "Please, it's Leah," she insisted before kneeling beside Eleanor's wheelchair. "Hello, Mrs. Mercer. I've heard so much about you." Eleanor studied the young woman with polite confusion before her gaze fixed on the orchid. "What a lovely color," she said, reaching out to touch one delicate petal. "Your grandson tells me you have quite a green thumb," Leah said, placing the plant carefully in Eleanor's lap. To everyone's surprise, Eleanor launched into a detailed explanation of orchid care, the proper watering schedule, the importance of indirect light, the dangers of overfeeding. It was one of her more coherent moments in weeks, sparked by the familiar subject of gardening and the respectful way Leah engaged with her. As they walked through the park, Eleanor occasionally dozing in her wheelchair while Martha pushed it along the path, Leah and Daniel fell into step together, slightly behind them. Catherine had stayed home to prepare lunch, giving Daniel unexpected privacy with the researcher. "Your grandmother's case is remarkable from a neurological perspective," Leah told him, after asking permission to discuss Eleanor's situation. "The fact that she survived independently for so long, despite her condition, challenges some of our assumptions about cognitive decline." "She wasn't exactly independent," Daniel corrected gently. "She had Martha." Leah nodded thoughtfully. "True, but from what you've shared, Martha provided basic care, but not the kind of intensive memory support we typically prescribe. Yet your grandmother maintained certain functional abilities. I wonder if there might be something we could learn from her experience." This conversation led to another unexpected development. With the family's permission, Eleanor began participating in a research study at the University Medical Center. The non-invasive cognitive tests and brain scans would not help Eleanor herself. Her disease had progressed too far, but might contribute to understanding that could benefit others. Leah, who had extended her stay in Portland to help establish the research protocol, became a frequent visitor to Daniel's apartment. Eleanor responded well to her presence, often showing more engagement during Leah's visits than at other times. Daniel found himself looking forward to these visits as well, for reasons that had less to do with his grandmother's care, and more to do with the way Leah's eyes crinkled when she smiled, or how she listened with complete attention when he spoke. "You're different when she's around," Catherine observed one evening after Leah had left. "More animated. It's good to see." Daniel felt himself flush. "She's just interested in Grandma's case." Catherine raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, leaving her son to his transparent denial. On the days when Eleanor was at the research center, Daniel found himself with rare free time. At Catherine's insistence, he began reconnecting with friends he had neglected, even cautiously dating again. Life was expanding beyond the tight orbit of caregiving that had defined him since Eleanor's return. His relationship with Leah developed gradually, beginning as professional collaboration, shifting to friendship, and eventually, tentatively, to something more. Their first kiss happened on a rainy evening after Eleanor had fallen asleep, when Leah had stayed late helping Daniel organize research paperwork. The attraction that had been building between them finally acknowledged, they began dating discreetly, careful to maintain professional boundaries regarding Eleanor's participation in the study. By late summer, a difficult decision loomed. Despite their best efforts, Eleanor's care needs were exceeding what they could safely provide at home. She had begun wandering again at night, had fallen twice, and was increasingly agitated during her confused periods. The strain was visible on both Daniel and Catherine. "We need to consider a memory care facility," Catherine said one evening after a particularly difficult day. "I know it's not what we wanted, but we have to think about what's best for her now." Daniel resisted initially, feeling as though they were giving up, abandoning Eleanor after having just found her again. But a frank conversation with her neurologist helped him see that the decision wasn't about abandonment, but about providing the specialized care she truly needed. The search for the right facility was emotional and exhausting. Daniel, Catherine, and even Martha visited dozens of places, scrutinizing staff interactions with residents, examining safety protocols, and assessing quality-of-life factors. Leah offered professional insights, helping them evaluate each facility's approach to memory care. "Remember," she told Daniel during a moment of particularly acute guilt, "moving her to a specialized facility isn't giving up. It's recognizing that she deserves the best possible care, even if you can't provide it yourself." The facility they selected was small, with a high staff-to-resident ratio and a focus on maintaining dignity and quality of life for people with advanced dementia. It was expensive, requiring them to sell Eleanor's house, which had remained unoccupied since her disappearance, but it offered the security and expertise they couldn't provide at home. The day they moved Eleanor into Sunrise Meadows Memory Care was gut-wrenching. Though they had prepared her as best they could, the transition to the unfamiliar environment triggered profound confusion and distress. She clung to Daniel's hand, repeatedly asking when they could go home, not understanding that this would now be her home. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, as staff gently encouraged him to leave at the end of that first day. "Every day, Grandma. I'll visit every day." Eleanor looked at him with such bewilderment that he almost changed his mind about the entire plan. But the facility's director, a compassionate woman with 20 years of experience in dementia care, assured him that the adjustment period was normal and would pass. "Go home," she told him kindly but firmly. "Get some rest. We'll call if there's any change, but what she needs now is time to settle in without the emotional strain of watching you watch her." The transition was difficult. Eleanor was confused and distressed by the new environment, and Daniel tortured himself with guilt each time he left after visiting. But gradually, she began to settle in, responding positively to the structured routines and engaging with music therapy sessions that seemed to reach her even when words couldn't. Daniel and Catherine maintained a schedule of daily visits, sometimes together, sometimes taking turns to give each other respite. Martha came once a week, bringing flowers from her garden and sitting quietly with Eleanor, occasionally sharing updates about the cat or the neighbors from the Blue House. A month after Eleanor's move to Sunrise Meadows, Martha arrived for her usual visit, looking uncharacteristically pale and drawn. She waited until the end of the visit, when Eleanor was participating in a group activity to share her news with Daniel and Catherine. "The doctor found a mass," she said simply, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "Pancreatic cancer. It's already spread quite extensively." Daniel and Catherine were stunned into momentary silence. Despite their complicated history with Martha, she had become an important part of their lives, a connection to Eleanor's missing years, a partner in her current care, and against all odds, something like a friend. "What's the treatment plan?" Catherine finally asked, her teacher's practicality asserting itself. Martha shook her head slightly. "There isn't one. Not really. At my age, with this type and stage, the doctor says maybe 6 months. A year, if I'm very lucky." She smiled faintly. "I've had a good life. I'm not afraid." In the weeks that followed, Martha's condition deteriorated more rapidly than expected. The cancer was aggressive, leaving her increasingly frail and in pain. Daniel and Catherine began driving her to her medical appointments, helping with groceries and household tasks, returning in some measure the care she had provided to Eleanor. They discussed whether to tell Eleanor about Martha's illness, but decided against it. In her current cognitive state, she likely wouldn't understand, and the information might only cause distress without comprehension. Instead, when Martha became too ill to visit, they explained simply that she wasn't feeling well today, but sent her love. Martha Collins passed away quietly in her sleep 3 months after her diagnosis. Her modest house and savings were left, as specified in her will, to a local animal shelter that cared for the nice cat who had been Eleanor's companion during those missing years. Daniel attended the funeral, standing alone at the back of the small chapel, feeling a complex gratitude for the woman who had both separated him from his grandmother and, in her imperfect way, preserved her life. The day after the funeral, Daniel brought a photograph of Martha to show Eleanor during his visit. He wasn't sure if she would understand or remember, but felt it important to acknowledge Martha's passing somehow. Eleanor studied the photograph with her usual polite confusion, then surprised Daniel by saying clearly, "Martha makes good soup." "Yes, she did," Daniel agreed, throat tight with unexpected emotion. Eleanor handed the photograph back, already losing interest. "Is it time for my program?" Life continued its inexorable forward movement. Catherine, who had put her career on indefinite hold to help with Eleanor, began to consider returning to teaching. A prestigious private school in Portland had offered her a position for the upcoming academic year. "I think I'm going to accept," she told Daniel over dinner one evening. "Being here, being part of Mom's care, it's been healing in ways I never expected, but I need to start rebuilding my own life too." Daniel nodded, understanding completely. His own life had expanded in similar ways. His relationship with Leah had deepened, moving from cautious dating to committed partnership. His freelance design work had evolved into a part-time position with a firm that specialized in healthcare communications, work that felt meaningful in light of his experiences with Eleanor and the healthcare system. On a golden October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Eleanor's miraculous discovery on live television, Daniel brought Leah to visit his grandmother at Sunrise Meadows. Eleanor was having an unusually good day, sitting in the garden courtyard, watching butterflies move among the late-blooming flowers. "Daniel," she said as he approached, his name coming easily to her for the first time in weeks. "I've been thinking about our chess games." He sat beside her, taking her frail hand in his. "Would you like to play, Grandma? I can bring a board next time." She shook her head slightly. "No, I was remembering when I taught you. You were 8, I think." "So serious," with your little frown. Her finger traced the space between his eyebrows, where that childhood frown had indeed often appeared. "You always wanted to protect your queen, even when it wasn't the right move." Daniel was stunned by this detailed recollection from a time when he had assumed all such memories were lost to her. "That's right," he said softly. "You told me sometimes you have to risk what's precious to win the game." Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting back to the butterflies. "I was lost for a very long time," she said, echoing words she had spoken once before. "But not anymore." She turned her attention to Leah then, studying her with unexpected focus. "Are you the one who brings the orchids?" Leah smiled, pleased to be remembered even in this fragmented way. "Yes, Mrs. Mercer, I brought you the purple one." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. "It's doing well. I told them how to care for it properly." She looked between Leah and Daniel, a spark of perception cutting through her confusion. "You're good for him," she said to Leah. "He needs someone who understands about the lost things." Daniel and Leah exchanged startled glances, touched by this moment of insight from Eleanor. They sat with her until the afternoon light began to fade, and staff came to escort residents inside for dinner. As they left, Eleanor called Daniel back for a moment. "I saw you on the television," she said, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "Did I imagine that?" Daniel knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hand. "No, Grandma, you didn't imagine it. I saw you too. That's how I found you again." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this confirmation of a memory that must have seemed like a dream to her confused mind. "Good," she said simply. "That's good." In the years that followed, Eleanor's condition continued its inevitable decline. The periods of recognition grew shorter, then disappeared entirely. Physical complications developed, requiring additional medical interventions. Daniel and Catherine remained constant presences in her life, even when it became unclear how much she understood of their visits. The research study that Eleanor had participated in yielded interesting preliminary findings. Leah, whose career was advancing rapidly with several published papers on the project, explained to Daniel that certain patterns in Eleanor's brain activity during memory tasks were unusual for someone with her degree of cognitive impairment. "There's a resilience there that we don't fully understand yet," she told him. "Something about her brain found ways to compensate, to maintain certain functions despite the disease's progression. It might be related to how she managed to survive and adapt during those 6 years with Martha. This possibility that Eleanor's extraordinary experience might contribute to understanding that could help other families affected by Alzheimer's provided Daniel with a measure of comfort as her condition worsened. Her struggle and their family's pain might serve some greater purpose, might spare others similar suffering. 2 years after Eleanor's move to Sunrise Meadows, Daniel proposed to Leah during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast. Their wedding, a small ceremony held in the memory care facility's garden so that Eleanor could attend, was bittersweet. Eleanor showed no recognition of the significance of the event, but seemed content to sit among the flowers, wearing the corsage that Catherine had carefully pinned to her sweater. Life settled into new patterns. Daniel and Leah bought a house not far from Sunrise Meadows, allowing for frequent visits to Eleanor. Catherine returned to teaching full-time, but remained deeply involved in her mother's care, visiting several times a week and coordinating with medical staff about treatment decisions. The Alzheimer's Foundation continued to develop the Eleanor Alert program, which expanded beyond Portland to several other cities. The system combined improved identification technology with community education, creating networks of trained individuals, from bus drivers to baristas, who knew how to recognize and respond to confused elderly people who might be lost. A year after their wedding, Leah discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy, tinged with sadness. Eleanor would never truly know her great-grandchild, never hold the baby with awareness of who this new life was. Yet Daniel felt a continuity in the overlapping of generations, a sense that even as one life ebbed, another was beginning. When Eleanor finally died, 5 years after her rediscovery, it was peaceful, a gentle transition that came after days of increasing stillness. Daniel and Catherine were both with her, holding her hands as her breathing slowed and finally ceased. The grief they felt was tempered by the knowledge that they had been given a rare second chance that many families never receive. The opportunity to say goodbye, to provide comfort in final years, to close the circle of care that Eleanor had once provided for them. The foundation Daniel had worked with asked permission to establish a program in Eleanor's name, a system for tracking and identifying confused elderly adults who wandered away from home or care facilities. The Eleanor Alert eventually spread nationwide, using advanced but non-invasive technology to help families avoid the anguish that the Mercers had endured. 3 months after Eleanor's funeral, Leah gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor Catherine Chen Mercer, Ellie for short. As Daniel held his newborn daughter, studying her tiny features for echoes of the grandmother she was named for, he felt the weight of his family's story settling into a new perspective. For Daniel, who had once built his entire life around the absence and then the care of his grandmother, her death necessitated another kind of rebuilding. He had postponed so much. Career advancement, relationships, his own dreams, first in searching for Eleanor and then in caring for her. Now, approaching 40, with a wife and daughter and meaningful work, he found himself facing a future that felt both anchored by purpose and open with possibility. The research based on Eleanor's unusual case continued to yield insights into the nature of memory and cognitive resilience. Leah, balancing motherhood with her career, published several influential papers on what had come to be called the Mercer Protocol, an approach to Alzheimer's care that emphasized maintaining familiar routines and activities even when cognitive decline was advanced. 6 months after Eleanor's funeral, Daniel sold his apartment in Portland and focused on his growing family. Catherine, who had rediscovered her love of teaching during their years of caregiving, continued her work at the private school, occasionally guest lecturing at the university on educational approaches for students with learning differences. "We'll always have that miracle," Catherine told her son during a quiet moment at Ellie's first birthday party. "No matter what else happens in our lives, we'll always have the day you saw her on television. How many people get a moment like that?" Daniel carried that thought with him as he built his new life. The apartment he had once shared with Eleanor was now filled with the sounds of his daughter's laughter and the busy rhythms of family life. Sometimes, when the light fell a certain way on silver hair or he glimpsed a blue cardigan in a crowd, his heart would still leap with that momentary, impossible hope. But unlike the years of searching, these brief pangs no longer devastated him. Instead, they served as gentle reminders of the grandmother who had taught him chess, who had loved him through his awkward teenage years, who had recognized him even when her mind was failing, and who had, against all odds, found her way back to him when it seemed all hope was lost. On the anniversary of that miraculous television broadcast each year, Daniel would sit quietly and watch the recording he had obtained from the news station. Those few precious seconds when Eleanor had appeared in the background of a routine street report, confused and lost, but somehow by incredible chance visible to the one person who would never stop looking for her. In those moments he was reminded that in a world often defined by loss and absence, reunions were still possible. Sometimes they came too late to reclaim all that had been taken. Sometimes they brought complications alongside joy, but they came, nevertheless. Small miracles happening in plain sight, if only we remembered to keep watching for them. As Ellie grew older, Daniel found ways to share Eleanor's story with her. Not the painful details of illness and loss, but the essence of who her great-grandmother had been. He taught her chess, using the same patient approach Eleanor had used with him. He showed her how to garden, recalling Eleanor's careful attention to each plant. He told her about the woman who had loved birds so much she'd spend hours guarding their nests, who had baked award-winning apple pies, who had found her way home against impossible odds. Was she magic? 5-year-old Ellie asked once, enchanted by the story of how Daniel had spotted Eleanor on television after years of searching. "No," Daniel answered thoughtfully, "not magic. But there was something magical about that moment. Sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it, in ways we could never expect." The story of Eleanor Mercer's disappearance and discovery eventually faded from public memory, replaced by newer headlines and different human dramas. But its impact lived on, in the improved protocols for identifying confused elderly adults, in the research that had benefited from Eleanor's participation, and most of all, in the lives of those who had loved her. For Daniel, who had once defined himself by the search for his missing grandmother, life expanded in ways he couldn't have imagined during those years of grief and uncertainty. He found purpose in his work with the foundation, joy in his growing family, and a sense of peace with the past that had once threatened to consume him. But he never forgot the lesson of those 6 lost years and the miraculous reunion that followed, that sometimes what seems forever lost can find its way home again, appearing suddenly in the background of an ordinary day, waiting to be recognized by those who have never truly stopped looking.